It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday evening in New York City, the kind of evening that millions of people live through without a second thought. The subway humming beneath the streets, strangers standing side by side on the platform, the distant sound of a train approaching through the dark tunnel. But on March 8th, 2026, on a platform along the Lexington Avenue and 63rd Street station in Manhattan, nothing about that evening would be ordinary, and by the time it was over, a man who had survived 5 years of cancer, who had served his country in the skies above, who had lived long enough to become a grandfather and a source of pride for his entire family, that man would be fighting for his life. His name was Richard Williams. He was 83 years old, and he never saw it coming. Let's go back. Let's understand who Richard Williams really was before we talk about how he died, because this story is about more than a crime. It's about a life, a long, full, remarkable life that was stolen in a matter of seconds. Richard Williams didn't just grow old, he earned every single one of those 83 years. He was a retired United States Air Force pilot, a man who had looked death in the face at altitude, who had trained and sacrificed and dedicated his body and his youth to the defense of a country he believed in. Long after his service ended, he remained that kind of man, disciplined, proud, present, the kind of grandfather who shows up, the kind of man who, even in his 80s, still had places to be and people who loved him. And if you needed any more proof of his strength, just 5 years before that March evening, Richard Williams was diagnosed with prostate cancer. For 5 years he fought, 5 years of treatments and fear and hope and pushing forward. And he won. He survived. His family breathed. His daughter watched her father beat the odds one more time. He had survived a war. He had survived cancer. He had survived everything life had thrown at him. But nobody knew that a man named Byron Posada-Hernandez was about to walk onto that platform. Now let's talk about Posada-Hernandez, because understanding who he is matters. Understanding how he ended up on that platform, standing just feet away from an 83-year-old veteran, matters deeply. Byron Posada-Hernandez was a 34-year-old Honduran national, and his history with law enforcement was not a short chapter. It was a book. 15 charges. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 15. Simple assault, domestic violence, obstruction of police, possession of a weapon, drug possession, aggravated assault. This was not a man with a minor blemish on his record. This was a man with a pattern, a documented, repeated, escalating pattern of violence and criminal behavior. And he had been deported from the United States not once, not twice, not 3 times, 4 separate occasions where the United States government removed him from this country. 4 separate occasions where he found a way back in, and each time he returned, he brought that history with him. On the evening of March 8th, Posada-Hernandez was on that subway platform at Lexington Avenue and 63rd Street in Manhattan. What brought him there exactly remains part of the investigation. But what happened next, what he did in those few seconds, would cost a man his life. Richard Williams was standing on the platform. He wasn't doing anything to provoke. He wasn't involved in any altercation. He was simply there, waiting, the way millions of New Yorkers wait every single day, trusting that the person standing next to them is just another stranger passing through the city. Without warning, without any provocation that investigators have been able to establish, Posada-Hernandez shoved Richard Williams onto the tracks. 83 years old, a cancer survivor, an Air Force veteran, and he was thrown off that platform and down onto the rails below. But this story, as devastating as it already is, has another layer, because Richard Williams was not the only person shoved that night. There was another man on that platform, a 30-year-old named Han Peña. He too was shoved by Posada-Hernandez. He too went onto the tracks, or was pushed toward them, and he too was injured. And here is where something extraordinary happened, something that, in the middle of all this darkness, stands as a testament to what human beings are capable of at their very best. Juan Peña, despite his own injuries, despite having just been attacked himself, reached down and pulled both himself and Richard Williams off those tracks. Think about what that means. Think about what it takes. You've just been shoved by a stranger. You're hurt. You're disoriented. The tunnel is dark, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the sound of an approaching train. Every instinct in your body is screaming at you to get yourself to safety. And instead of doing that, instead of saving only himself, Juan Peña turned back. He grabbed Richard Williams and he pulled. That train arrived, and because of Juan Peña, both men were off the tracks when it did. It was an act of heroism in the truest sense of the word. No time to think, no time to calculate the risk, just a split-second decision to help another human being, even at great personal cost. But the damage had already been done. Richard Williams had suffered serious injuries in the fall. He was transported to a hospital. Doctors fought to stabilize him. They performed surgery to address a brain bleed, a serious, life-threatening condition that occurs when the brain is rattled or struck with enough force. For days, his family waited. His daughter, who had already watched her father beat cancer, was now watching him fight again. But this time was different. Richard Williams did not regain brain activity following surgery. He held on for 9 days. 9 days in which his family must have prayed and hoped and held their breath. 9 days in which the city continued to move around him, unaware of the quiet battle being fought in that hospital room. On March 17, 2026, Richard Williams passed away. The medical examiner ruled his death a homicide. A man who had flown for his country, a man who had raised a family, a man who had beaten cancer, killed on a New York City subway platform by a stranger who should never have been in this country. Now, let's go back to what was happening on the law enforcement side, because the response to this crime and the charges that followed tell their own important story. When Byron Posada-Hernandez was apprehended, he was initially charged on March 10th with attempted murder, attempted assault, and reckless endangerment. These were serious charges, but at that point, Richard Williams was still alive. Investigators and prosecutors were watching and waiting. Then, Richard Williams died, and everything changed. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg announced that the charges against Byron Posada-Hernandez had been upgraded to second-degree murder. This is one of the most serious charges a person can face in the state of New York. It carries the potential for decades in prison. It is the legal system's recognition that what happened on that platform was not an accident, not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a violent act that ended a human life. Posada-Hernandez's arraignment on the upgraded charges was scheduled for March 30th, but the legal proceedings were only one part of the conversation that Richard Williams' death ignited. Because his story reached far beyond the courtroom, it reached into the halls of government. It reached into the offices of senators and deputies and officials who saw in this tragedy something larger than one man's death. Deputy Assistant Secretary Lauren Bies did not mince words. She called Posada-Hernandez, in direct terms, a serial criminal and a 4-time deported illegal alien from Honduras. She said he should never have been able to walk the streets of this country and harm innocent Americans. And she was right. By any measure, by any reading of his record, Posada-Hernandez had been identified repeatedly as a danger. He had been removed from this country 4 separate times, and each time the system failed to keep him out, and that failure ultimately cost Richard Williams his life. Senator Rick Scott of Florida, who chairs the Senate's Special Committee on Aging, also responded publicly. His words were direct and emotional. He noted that Richard Williams had selflessly served his country, and that he died at the hands of someone who never should have been permitted to be here. He said plainly and with unmistakable frustration that this should never happen, that this was not what Williams served for. And there is something deeply painful about sitting with that truth. Richard Williams put on a uniform, he trained, he flew, he gave years of his life, young years, formative years, to the defense of this nation. He did it because he believed in something, because he believed this country was worth protecting. And in the final years of his long life, after he had beaten cancer and watched his grandchildren grow, he was standing on a subway platform in the city he called home, and a man who had been deported 4 times, a man with 15 criminal charges, was there on that same platform. What happened next shocked everyone who heard it, not because violence is unheard of in New York City, not because the subway system hasn't seen tragedy before, but because of who Richard Williams was, because of what he represented, because there is something uniquely gutting about a decorated Air Force veteran, a cancer survivor, a grandfather, dying this way, randomly, violently, without reason or warning or justice in that moment. Juan Peña's heroism deserves to be named again, because in the chaos of that platform, he was the one human being who refused to let the worst happen without a fight. He could not stop Williams from being pushed. He could not reverse the injury that had already been done. But he pulled that man out of the path of that train. He gave Richard Williams 9 more days. He gave his family 9 more days. And in doing so, he demonstrated that even in the darkest moments, there are people who choose courage, people who choose to reach back instead of run forward. That should not be forgotten. In a story full of grief and outrage, Juan Peña is a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. But the grief remains, and it is legitimate. An 83-year-old man is dead, a grandfather, a veteran, a man who spent 5 years fighting cancer and won, only to be robbed of whatever time remained to him by an act of senseless violence. His daughter lost her father, his grandchildren lost their grandfather, and the family is left to carry the weight of that loss while also watching the story of how it happened play out on national news, in congressional statements, in legal proceedings. That is an unbearable kind of grief, the kind that doesn't just come with sadness, but with questions, questions that don't have clean answers, questions about systems and failures and what could have been different, what should have been different. Because here is the thing about Byron Posada-Hernandez, the thing that makes this so difficult to sit with. He was known, his history was documented, 15 criminal charges, 4 deportations. This was not a man who slipped through because there was no information about him. There was plenty of information. The information existed. The record was there. And yet somehow he was standing on a platform in Manhattan, and Richard Williams paid for that with his life. That is the question that lingers. That is the wound that doesn't close easily, not just for Williams's family, but for anyone who believes that the systems we build are supposed to protect people, that laws are supposed to mean something, that records like Posada-Hernandez's are supposed to result in consequences that actually stick. They didn't, and an 83-year-old Air Force veteran is dead. As the legal process moves forward, as Posada-Hernandez faces arraignment and the wheels of justice begin to turn, the family of Richard Williams is left to do what families in these situations always have to do. They have to grieve. They have to find a way to honor the man they lost while the world debates the circumstances of his death. They have to carry his memory forward while courtrooms and congressional committees and news anchors turn his final moments into a national conversation. Richard Williams deserves to be remembered more than a cautionary tale. He deserves to be remembered as a man, a pilot, a father, a grandfather, a fighter who beat cancer and lived 8 more decades full enough to make anyone proud. A man who believed in this country enough to serve it, and who deserved at the very minimum to be safe in it. His system failed him. That is simply true, and whatever debates follow about immigration policy, about deportation enforcement, about the failures that allowed a 4-time deported serial criminal to walk the streets of New York, at the center of it all is a human being who did not deserve this, a family that did not deserve this, a daughter who watched her father survive cancer only to lose him on a subway platform. That is the story, and it is not a comfortable one. It should not be a comfortable one. Because the moment we become comfortable with stories like this, the moment we stop feeling the weight of them, is the moment we stop demanding better from our systems, from our institutions, from the structures that are supposed to exist to protect the most vulnerable among us. Richard Williams was 83 years old. He had served, he had survived, he had earned every right to live out his final years in peace and safety. He deserved better. And until the systems that failed him are honestly reckoned with, and until the questions his death raises are met with real answers and real accountability, his story will continue to demand to be told. Rest in peace, Richard Williams, veteran, father, grandfather, survivor, a man who gave this country everything and who deserved so much more.